The 1830s were the height of slavery in the U.S. Virginia was the only state still importing slaves, so their economy relied most heavily on the use of slaves. In the state of Virginia, slaves made up 40% of the population. In the North, some of the states had already abolished slavery, while most of the South still supported slavery. However, the North did benefit from slavery, so they weren't as outspoken about fighting against it as they were later on. At the time, there weren't many laws protecting the slaves, meaning their owners could force them to work long hours, beat them, or starve them. Especially after the abolition of slavery in some northern states about 50 years earlier, many slaves wanted abolition where they lived. However, before Nat Turner, no slave was successful in making a significant impact in the lives of slaves.
That evil that he saw was what was needed to be destroyed. And the only way to force the destruction of that evil was to make the price so high that those who was practicing slavery would eventually sue for peace and says, we cannot keep slavery because it will cost us too much.
Nat Turner, leader of the Southampton Slave Rebellion, successfully ignited fear in the white people of America in the 1800s through extreme violence. Furthermore, his legacy and bold pursuit for slaves' rights brought about the chain of events leading to the Civil War. Nat Turner was born into slavery on October 2, 1800, on the plantation of Benjamin Turner. He was educated by his master's son and was very religious from a young age. As he grew older, he would often preach to his fellow slaves. Because of his mother's insistence, Turner always believed he was the one chosen by God to lead the slaves to freedom. He was further convinced of this when he thought he received visions from God. One such vision was really a solar eclipse, which convinced him that it was time to start a rebellion. He assembled a few other slaves to help him prepare by planning out a route and obtaining weapons. On August 21, 1831, they traveled from house to house in Southampton County, killing every white person they encountered, including women and children. The only exception was a family of poor white farmers who didn't own any slaves. Turner reasoned that they thought no better of themselves than they did of the Negroes. Often considered one of the most brutal slave rebellions, his small army multiplied as they moved through the town, killing about 60 white men, women, and children.
Paranoia shoots off the scale. 50 dead today, how many dead tomorrow?
Without Nat Turner, the rebellion would not have occurred. However, without his followers, the rebellion would not have been successful. He obtained his followers through his persuasive speaking. They were attracted to his intelligence and religious fervor. Turner was one of the few educated slaves, so the others trusted the potential of his ideas. His ability to fuse religion with politics was important, and how much he was able to convey a sense of doing what was right in God's eyes. Unlike many followers of tyrannical leaders, Turner's followers joined him by choice. Although his leadership qualities are extremely clear, the morality of his actions are far more ambiguous. His motive, to free himself and others from the cruelty of slavery, is unquestionably just, as he is entitled to his freedom and has the right to fight for it. However, the means he used to attain this is less so. Although he spared the non-slave-owning white family, he did not spare the wives and children of slave owners. Turner had no way of knowing if every white person was directly oppressing him and therefore deserved to be killed. Perhaps this can best be explained by the quote, "He has the right to get his freedom, but he doesn't have the right to kill people just because they happen to be there and aren't preventing him from getting his freedom." On their way to the neighboring town of Jerusalem, Turner and his army were stopped by the militia. A number of his followers were killed, and between 60 and 70 were captured. However, Nat Turner escaped and lived in hiding for the next 6 weeks. He was discovered accidentally by a farmer named Benjamin Phipps, who turned him in. During his imprisonment, his lawyer Thomas Gray wrote down all of his confessions and later published them in a book. Turner held nothing back, stating, "The time was fast approaching when the first should be last, and the last shall be first." On November 5th, he was tried, and the jury stated, after hearing the testimony and from all the circumstances of the case, are unanimously of the opinion that the prisoner is guilty. A few days later he was hanged and his body was skinned. Within a few months following the rebellion, about 200 innocent slaves were murdered by white mobs because the white people were terrified that a similar uprising would reoccur. Turner's rebellion made slaveholders in the South very worried about the possibility of another rebellion, and so they became much more stringent about controlling their slaves and about absolutely not tolerating any kind of criticism of slavery. This sharpened the tension between people supporting abolition and those who believed in keeping slavery. Slave owners were right to be worried, as in the years following Nat Turner's rebellion, a number of other uprisings occurred, such as the Creole Revolt and Harper's Ferry. The leader in the attack on Harper's Ferry was John Brown, a strong figure in the abolitionist movement. A conference was held to discuss the issue of slavery in Virginia. Abolishing slavery completely was considered, but instead it was decided that stricter slave codes should be created. This was to control the slaves and prevent future rebellions, but it only made the slaves angrier and more desperate to be free.
The Turner Rebellion frightened whites literally out of their minds, and yet even that wasn't strong enough to provoke them to get rid of slavery as an institution.
Turner's rebellion inspired other slaves in the South to rebel against their masters and participate in the steadily growing abolitionist movement. In 1833, the American Anti-Slavery Society was founded by William Lloyd Garrison, which fought to liberate all slaves. Slaveholders were worried about Nat Turner because of the kind of subversive religious message that he preached. They wanted to be sure their slaves got the kind of religious message that was more favorable to the slave owners. The North was more accepting of this new idea than the South. The South blamed the occurrence of the rebellion on the North, claiming that their anti-slavery ideas had influenced the slaves. A Southerner would have been raised to believe that slavery was beneficial for the blacks, and naturally would not have considered the idea that they should be free. The rebellion brought attention to the injustice of slavery in the South, and Northerners became more passionate about fighting against slavery. This disagreement created a wider gap between the North and the South. By 1840, slaves were non-existent in the North, but made up nearly 55% of the population in some Southern states. This conflict ultimately led to the Civil War. In leading his rebellion and thus igniting fear in the white people, Nat Turner caused the arrival of the Civil War. His love of religion was an attribute that attracted many followers that allowed the rebellion to be a success.